Thexmore conceded defeat 3 days after the trial, a formal acknowledgement that was recorded and distributed across the galactic network, and while his statement was brief and clearly painful for him to deliver, he added a warning that making monsters into allies might protect some colonies, but could also create new dangers that the galaxy was unprepared to face, and Taman understood his fear even if he disagreed with his conclusions, because change was always frightening, especially when it involved rewriting rules that had kept people safe for millennia. Academy Council voted unanimously to establish a new department, Predator Integration Studies, and they offered co-directorship to Taman and Hyejin, which was simultaneously the greatest honor and the most terrifying responsibility either of them had ever received, and they accepted because someone needed to do this work, and they were apparently the only ones who had both the knowledge and the instincts to do it. Properly, applications from human students flooded, and within hours of the announcement, dozens and then hundreds of young people who had grown up on Earth or Earth colonies and had always felt comfortable around animals that other species found terrifying, and they came with stories about bonding with aggressive alien fauna and calming predators that were supposed to be untrainable, and Taman realized that his experience was not unique, but just the first time someone had documented it properly. Velthar became humanity's most vocal advocate in xenobiology circles, writing papers that synthesized 9 centuries of predator knowledge with new insights about human capabilities, and his reconstructed jaw clicked when he spoke, but his words carried weight, because he had lived through having his face broken and still concluded that human handlers were the future of predator management rather than its downfall. The papers he authored, with Hyejin, became required reading in xenobiology, programs across 17 systems, documents titled The Predators, Peace and Understanding Apex Recognition Patterns, and Why Death World Evolution Creates Natural Handlers. And students who had spent years believing they understood dangerous creatures suddenly had to reconsider everything through the lens of human instincts that made the impossible seem routine. News spread through the galactic community faster than official reports could track, carried by students returning home and researchers sharing findings and security footage of Taman's trial that was viewed billions of times across thousands of worlds, and the response was predictably mixed, depending on whether species saw humans as potential saviors or potential threats. Colonies plagued by dangerous megafauna started requesting human handlers. Settlements that had been losing people to predator attacks for generations suddenly had hope that coexistence might be possible instead of endless warfare. And Taman found himself reviewing requests from worlds he had never heard of, asking if someone could come teach their local death machines to be neighbors instead of killers. Military forces approached more quietly through official channels. Representatives from defense organizations who saw potential in training war beasts that had previously been deemed too unstable for tactical deployment, and Taman had to navigate careful political waters explaining that teaching predators trust was not the same as weaponizing them, and he refused to turn apex species into tools of violence no matter how much they offered to pay. Some species reacted with fear that manifested as political opposition, representatives arguing in galactic forums that humans might use their abilities to control predator populations and threaten other civilizations, and there were proposals to restrict human movement or require monitoring or even prevent them from working with certain species categories. And Taman watched those debates with frustration because he was trying to build bridges, not weapons. But other species saw hope. Representatives from worlds that had abandoned colonies due to predator problems or had species going extinct because they could not manage ecosystem balance without killing apex predators that were crucial to environmental stability, and they spoke passionately about how human handlers could help them reclaim lost territory and save species and build sustainable futures. 6 months after the trial, Taman stood in front of the Galactic Council's assembly, a space designed to hold representatives from 300 worlds and make anyone who addressed them feel appropriately small and insignificant. And Ash sat beside his podium, now fully grown into an adult Riftclaw, massing 500 kilograms of muscle and loyalty. The human delegation included Minyo with a pack of 3 void stalkers that moved like liquid shadows, and Yunji with a thornworm coiled around her shoulders like a living piece of armor, and Hyejin with a juvenile razorclaw that was supposed to be solitary and aggressive, but followed her with the devotion of a creature that had never learned it was supposed to hate things. Taman presented the Apex Accord, a proposal that represented hundreds of hours of work and debate and refinement, a framework for integrating human handlers into ecosystems across the galaxy, not as conquerors or controllers but as mediators who could help predator species and civilizations coexist peacefully. The proposal outlined training programs and certification, standards and ethical guidelines that prioritized species welfare over human convenience, and it included provisions for monitoring and accountability and restrictions on military applications, and it emphasized that the goal was partnership rather than domestication, teaching predators to trust specific humans while maintaining their wild nature. And ecological roles. Representatives asked questions that ranged from genuinely curious to aggressively skeptical, and Taman answered each one with the patience that came from understanding that fear was natural when people confronted something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how the universe worked. A representative from a prey species civilization asked, what would prevent humans from using bonded predators to threaten others? And Taman explained that predator bonds were based on trust and respect, and trying to force them into violence against their nature would break those bonds immediately. And besides, humans understood better than anyone that predators were not weapons, but living beings with their own agency. A representative from a predator species asked whether humans would try to domesticate their people, the way they were domesticating other apex creatures, and Taman had to clarify that sapient beings were completely different from non-sapient predators, and human instincts responded to animal behavior patterns, not to conscious intelligent choices, and suggesting otherwise was insulting to both species. The debate continued for hours, and Taman could feel exhaustion creeping through his body, but he kept his posture confident because this mattered more than his comfort, and Ash seemed to sense his fatigue because the Rift Claw shifted position to provide support, and other delegates noticed, and he saw their expressions change as they processed that a creature capable of killing a person in seconds was instead offering comfort. Velthar spoke in support of the proposal, his cybernetic jaw clicking with each word but his voice carrying conviction that came from experience, and he explained that in 900 years he had never seen better outcomes for predator welfare than what human handlers achieved, and refusing to utilize that capability because of fear would be a tragic waste that would result in more dead colonists and more extinct species. The vote was called after 16 hours of debate, and Taman watched the display showing representative positions with his heart hammering, because this would determine not just his future, but the future of human involvement in galactic ecology. And the numbers climbed slowly as votes registered across hundreds of worlds. The Apex Accord passed with 73% approval, which was not unanimous but was overwhelming enough to establish a clear mandate. And Taman felt relief wash through him so intensely that his knees went weak, and Ash made a concerned sound and pressed against him, providing physical support while the assembly erupted in various displays of approval or displeasure, depending on how individual representatives had voted. Implementation began immediately, because bureaucracy moved slowly except when it moved fast, and human handlers were deployed to 12 worlds within the first month. Carefully selected individuals with proven abilities working under strict guidelines to establish precedents and demonstrate that the Accord's principles could work in practice. Taman received reports regularly, messages from handlers describing breakthroughs and challenges and moments of connection with apex predators that xenobiologists had spent careers studying without truly understanding. And each success felt like validation, while each setback reminded him how much they still needed to learn. A decade passed faster than seemed possible when measured in moments of crisis and triumph, and Taman looked back on those years with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, because changing the galaxy's relationship with apex predators had required more work than he had ever imagined. Human-bonded predator sanctuaries existed on 40 worlds now, facilities where dangerous species could live with dignity, while trained handlers managed their populations and facilitated coexistence with. The transport ship broke through the atmosphere of Helion Prime, and Taesung pressed his face against the small window to see the massive military academy floating in orbit around the gas giant below. And the station was enormous, with thousands of lights blinking across its surface like stars, and ships of every size moved around it like insects around a hive. And Taesung felt his stomach tighten, because this was it, and this was where everything would change for him and for every human who came after him. The other passengers in the transport were quiet, and most of them were aliens from species Taesung had only seen in training videos back on Earth, and there was a tall, insect-like creature with 4 arms sitting across from him, and its compound eyes never blinked, and next to it sat something that looked like a floating jellyfish surrounded by a bubble of purple gas, and near the back a small bird person chirped nervously to itself, and Tae-sung realized he was the only human on this transport, and that made him feel very alone. When the ship docked and the doors opened, Tae-sung grabbed his single bag and followed the other cadets into the processing center, and the gravity felt strange here, and it was lighter than Earth, and he had to concentrate to keep his steps small so he would not bounce like the others clearly expected him to do. And an alien behind a desk looked up as he approached, and it had 8 legs like a spider, and its eyes were arranged in a circle around its head, and it clicked something that the translator in Tae-sung's ear turned into words. "Your identification, please." And Tae-sung handed over his data chip, and the spider creature inserted it into a reader, and its many eyes widened slightly, and "You are one of the humans," and it said the word humans the way someone might say plague or disaster. And Tae-sung nodded. "And yes, sir." And the spider creature made a sound like escaping steam. "And you understand that the mortality rate for your species in training is projected at 12%. And Tae-sung felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "And I understand, sir." And the alien stared at him for a long moment before sliding a data pad across the desk. "And you are assigned to Training Squadron Theta 7, and your quarters are in Section 9, and gravity there has been adjusted to .8 Earth standard for your comfort, and report to the main training hall at 0600 tomorrow," and dismissed. Tae-sung took the data pad and followed the lighted path through corridors that seemed too large and too empty, and the ceilings were high, and the doorways were wide, and everything was built for beings of different sizes and shapes, and twice he had to step aside as larger aliens passed him, and neither acknowledged his existence, and finally he found Section 9, and inside his quarters were small but clean, with a bed that looked too soft and a desk and a small bathroom, and he dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the bed and put his face in his hands. 3 years of training on Earth and 6 months in low-orbit combat school, and now he was here, and he was 22 years old, and he was representing not just himself, but his entire species, and the weight of that felt heavier than Earth's gravity ever had. The next morning, Tae-sung arrived at the training hall early, and the room was massive, with a ceiling so high he could barely see it, and other cadets were already there, standing in small groups and talking in languages the translator could not quite keep up with, and Tae-sung saw 2 other humans across the room, and relief flooded through him, and he started toward them when a voice like grinding rocks filled the hall. "All cadets will form ranks," and the voice came from a creature that stood at least 3 meters tall, with scales that looked like they were made of dark metal, and a head shaped like a wedge, and rows of teeth that glinted like broken glass behind its lips, and this was Admiral Korvax, and Tae-sung had seen pictures, but pictures did not capture the sense of absolute danger that radiated from the creature like heat from a fire. The cadets scrambled into lines, and Tae-sung found himself in the 3rd row, and the 2 other humans were nearby, and the stocky one caught his eye and nodded once, and the female looked straight ahead with no expression on her face, and Admiral Korvax walked slowly down the ranks, and his clawed feet clicked on the metal floor, and when he reached the humans he stopped. "So these are the Deathworlders," and his voice was filled with something that might have been amusement or might have been contempt, and Tae-sung could not tell which, and the Admiral leaned down until his face was level with Tae-sung's, and breath that smelled like copper washed over him. "And you are from Earth?" And Tae-sung met those yellow eyes, and, "Yes, sir." And the Admiral's lips pulled back. "And I have seen your planet's files, and your species evolved as persistence hunters, and you chased your prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and you ate meat, and you made weapons, and you killed each other in numbers that would depopulate entire worlds in the coalition. And tell me, cadet, why should we trust such creatures with military authority?" Tae-sung felt anger flash through him, but he kept his voice level. "And because we are here to serve, sir, and we will follow the same rules as every other species." And the Admiral stared at him, and then made a sound that might have been a laugh, and we shall see. And he moved on down the line, but Tae-sung could feel the weight of his attention even after he passed. Training began immediately, and the first exercise was zero gravity combat, and Admiral Korvax paired the cadets deliberately, and Tae-sung found himself matched against Krixtel, and the tall insectoid from the transport, and Crixtel was twice Taesung's size with 4 arms and an exoskeleton that looked hard. A stone, and they entered the combat sphere and gravity cut out and Taesung pushed off the wall. But Crixtel was faster, and one of those 4 arms caught Taesung across the chest and sent him spinning. And before he could recover, Crixtel was on him, and 2 arms grabbed him and the other 2 struck his ribs and his face, and Taesung tried to defend himself, but it was like fighting a machine. And finally, Crixtel slammed him into the wall so hard that Taesung's vision went white. The combat ended and gravity returned, and Taesung fell to the floor and coughed blood onto the metal. And around him he heard the other cadets whispering, and through his translator, he caught words like weak and fragile and pathetic. And he pushed himself to his hands and knees and then to his feet, and his ribs screamed and his face was swelling. But he stood. Admiral Korvax watched him with those yellow eyes and adequate performance from Cadet Crixtel, and disappointing showing from the human, and he turned away as if Taesung was not worth another moment of attention, and dismissed, and the cadets filed out. And the stocky human came over and grabbed Taesung's arm, and steady there, and his name was Junwoo, and the female was Hyejin, and she looked at Taesung's injuries with clinical detachment and "You need medical attention," and Taesung shook his head. "And I am fine." And Junwoo snorted, "And you are not fine. But you are standing, and that is what matters. And they are testing us, and they want to see us break." Over the following days the pattern became clear, and Admiral Korvax was systematically trying to destroy them. And the gravity in their training sessions was increased until the other cadets moved normally, but the humans struggled under weight that felt like wearing a suit of lead, and the tactical scenarios they were given were designed to be impossible, and no matter what choices they made, they failed. And during classroom instruction, the Admiral asked them questions that had no right answers, and then mocked them when they could not respond, and their food rations were cut, and they were assigned extra duties and given less sleep, and it went on and on and on. But humans were stubborn, and Taesung learned that about himself and about Junwoo and Hyejin during those weeks, and they did not break, and they did not quit. And when Crixtel shoved Taesung in the corridor, Taesung got up, and when the Admiral increased the gravity again, they adapted, and when they failed scenarios, they analyzed what went wrong and tried to do better next time. And slowly, very slowly, something changed in how the other cadets looked at them, and the small bird creature named Prill started leaving extra food near their table in the mess hall, and the floating gas being named Unlar began helping Hyejin with technical problems when the instructors would not. And Admiral Korvax watched it all with eyes that revealed nothing, and Taesung knew that something was building toward a breaking point, and he did not know what form it would take, but he knew it was coming. And he tried to prepare himself, but there was no way to prepare for what the Admiral planned, and when it came, it would change everything. The morning of the assembly, Admiral Korvax walked through the training halls with purpose, and his clawed feet clicked rhythmically on the metal floors, and behind him 2 security drones floated silently, and every cadet who saw him coming pressed themselves against the walls and kept their eyes down, and he radiated danger like a sun radiated heat. And when he passed, the whispers started, and something was happening, and something big. Taesung was in the equipment room, cleaning combat gear, when Prill found him, and the small bird creature was shaking, and its feathers were puffed up in distress and assembly. And it chirped in mandatory assembly in 10 minutes, and all cadets and all instructors, and Taesung looked up and, "What is it about?" And Prill's round eyes were huge, and "I do not know, but the Admiral ordered it personally, and please be careful." And then the little creature hurried away. In the corridor, Taesung found Junwoo and Hyejin, and they walked together toward the main assembly hall, and neither spoke, but Taesung could see the tension in their shoulders, and they knew as he knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for, and Admiral Korvax had been building toward something, and now it was here. The assembly hall was enormous and could hold thousands, and today it held over 300 cadets from more than 40 species, and they stood in loose formation facing the raised platform at the front, and instructors lined the walls and the ceiling. It was so high that the lights seemed like distant stars, and the room smelled of dozens of different atmospheres and biochemistries mixing together. And Taesung took his place in the formation, and Junwoo stood to his left, and Hyejin to his right, and around them the alien cadets shifted nervously. Admiral Korvax entered through the main doors, and the room fell silent, and he walked slowly to the platform and climbed the steps and stood looking out over the assembled cadets, and his scales seemed to drink in the light and his teeth gleamed, and when he spoke, his voice filled every corner of that vast space. "We are here today to discuss discipline," and he said the word like it was sacred. And discipline is what separates military forces from armed mobs, and it is what allows the coalition to maintain peace across 3,000 worlds, and without discipline we are nothing. And murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and the Admiral nodded, but there are those among us who do not understand discipline, and there are those who come from worlds where might makes right and where violence is the first response to any challenge. Taesung felt his stomach drop, and he knew where this was going. The Death Worlders and Admiral. Korvax gestured toward the humans and three faces in a sea of aliens, and these cadets come from a world called Earth. And Earth is what we classify as a Class 12 death world. And the atmosphere is corrosive and the gravity is crushing, and the native life is extraordinarily hostile, and somehow these creatures not only survived but thrived, and they became the apex predators of their entire planet. And he paused, but apex predators do not make good soldiers, and predators do not understand discipline, and they understand only strength and dominance and violence. The other cadets were staring now, and some with curiosity, and some with contempt, and some with what might have been pity. And Crixtel, the tall insectoid, was nodding, along with the Admiral's words, and Taesung felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his face neutral and kept his breathing steady. Perhaps a demonstration would be educational, and Admiral Korvax's eyes fixed on Taesung and Cadet. Taesung, and front and center, and Taesung's legs moved before his brain caught up, and he walked through the formation and climbed the steps to the platform and stood facing the Admiral. And up close, the creature was even more massive and more terrifying, and Taesung had to tilt his head back to meet those yellow eyes. "Tell the assembly, Cadet," and the Admiral's voice was almost gentle. "And why did your species develop such elaborate violence?" And Taesung swallowed. "And because our world was dangerous, sir, and we needed to survive." And the Admiral nodded as if this confirmed everything, and you needed to survive, and so you became dangerous yourselves, and you created weapons, and you waged wars, and you nearly destroyed your own planet. Multiple times, and is this correct? "Yes, sir, but—" And Taesung tried to continue, but the Admiral cut him off. "And no qualifications, Cadet, and a simple yes or no. And did your species nearly destroy itself?" And Taesung's jaw clenched. "And yes, sir." And the Admiral turned to address the crowd, "And you see, and this is what we are dealing with, and a species so violent that they are a threat to themselves, and how can we trust them not to be a threat to us?" Junwoo took a step forward in the formation, and Hyejin grabbed his arm and held him back, and her face was expressionless, but her knuckles were white, and around them other cadets were whispering, and the tide of opinion was turning against the humans, and Taesung could feel it like a physical pressure. Admiral circled him slowly. "And you are weak," and he said, "and you are undisciplined, and you are dangerous, and these three things make you unfit for coalition service, and perhaps we made a mistake accepting your species, and perhaps we should rectify that mistake." And he stopped directly in front of Taesung. "And perhaps a physical lesson will succeed where verbal instruction has failed." Everything seemed to slow down, and Taesung saw the Admiral's hand coming up, and saw those clawed fingers reaching for him, and saw in the Admiral's eyes a kind of satisfaction. And the hand closed on Taesung's collar and lifted, and Taesung's feet left the ground, and he hung there suspended. And around the hall 300 cadets watched and waited for him to submit. And something in Taesung's brain clicked over, and it was not a conscious decision, and it was older than thought and older than civilization. And it was the part of him that his ancestors used when the saber-toothed cats came in the night, and when the rival tribes attacked at dawn, and when the mammoths charged, and it was the part that said, "If something grabs you, then you hurt it until it lets go." His right hand formed a fist, and his arm snapped forward, and his knuckles connected with the Admiral's jaw, and there was a sound like breaking pottery. And the Admiral's head rocked sideways, and his hand released Taesung's collar, and Taesung dropped and landed on his feet in a fighter's crouch, and his heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. Admiral Korvax staggered back, and his hand went to his mouth, and when he pulled it away there was blue blood on his fingers, and something else, and pieces of his teeth, and 3 of the crystalline fangs that had been sharp and whole were now shattered stumps, and 2 more were cracked, and the Admiral stared at the broken pieces in his palm, like he could not understand what he was seeing. The assembly hall was absolutely silent, and no one moved and no one breathed. And 300 beings watched a human cadet standing on the platform, and an admiral of the coalition bleeding from his mouth. And for a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. Then Tae-sung straightened, and he was not thinking clearly, and his body was flooded with adrenaline, and his vision had narrowed to a tunnel, and he looked out at the crowd of cadets and at the instructors along the walls, and at the security drones hovering near the ceiling, and he heard his own voice saying, words that came from that same ancient place, and who is next? Junwoo broke formation and started toward the platform, and Hee-jin was right behind him, and they took positions on either side of Tae-sung, and Junwoo's face was split in a feral grin, and Hee-jin's expression was cold and calculating, and 3 humans stood together and waited. Admiral Korvax straightened, and his hand was still at his jaw, and blue blood dripped onto his uniform, and his eyes were wide, and for the first time since Tae-sung had met him, the Admiral looked uncertain, and he looked at the 3 humans and then at the crowd and then back at the humans, and when he spoke his voice was tight with pain and barely controlled rage and security and restrain. These cadets, and confine them to quarters, and formal charges will be filed within the hour. The security drones descended, and more guards came through the doors, and they surrounded the humans, but notably none of them tried to actually touch them. And Tae-sung let himself be herded off the platform and out of the hall, and behind him he heard the explosion of voices as 300 cadets all tried to talk at once, and he caught fragments through his translator. And did you see that? And the human struck him and broke his teeth and the Admiral's teeth, and I cannot believe. And but why did he and Deathworlders are insane, and we should never have let them in. In the corridor, Hee-jin walked close to Tae-sung, and that was either very brave or very stupid, and her voice was quiet, and I am not sure which. And Tae-sung's hands were shaking now as the adrenaline faded, and I am not sure either. And Junwoo laughed, and it was a sound without humor, and it does not matter now, and what is done, is done. And we will face whatever comes next together. They were separated and taken to individual quarters under guard, and Tae-sung sat on his bed and put his head in his hands and tried to understand what he had done. And he had struck a superior officer, and he had done it in front of hundreds of witnesses, and there was no defense for that and no excuse, and he would be expelled at minimum, and possibly prosecuted and possibly imprisoned, and his career was over before it began. And worse, he had confirmed every terrible thing the Admiral had said about humans and about violence and about being dangerous. The tribunal convened in a chamber that seemed designed to make anyone standing in its center feel small, and the walls curved upward into shadows, and the judges sat on a raised platform behind a curved desk of dark metal, and lights pointed down at the accused like accusatory fingers, and Tae-sung stood alone in the center circle, and his hands were clasped behind his back, and his uniform was crisp and clean. But inside, he felt hollow. Grand Magistrate Thelnora was the center judge, and it was a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline framework, and its voice when it spoke seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And this tribunal is convened to hear charges against Cadet Tae-sung of Earth, and the charges are assault upon a superior officer and conduct unbecoming a coalition cadet, and potential violations of the Military Justice Code Articles 7 and 12. And how does the cadet plead? Guilty, and Tae-sung's voice was steady, and there was no point in denying what 300 beings had witnessed, and the magistrate's energy flickered in what might have been surprise, and you do not wish to offer a defense. And Tae-sung met that impossible gaze, and I struck Admiral Korvax, and that is a fact, and I will not insult this tribunal by claiming otherwise, and whether there were reasons is for you to decide. To the magistrate's left sat Battle Commander Krell, and the 4-armed Zenthari warrior was covered in scars from 100 campaigns, and its face was unreadable. And to the right was Academic Chancellor Porvin, and the scholarly Videnian had skin like polished stone and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. And together these 3 would decide Tae-sung's fate and the fate of every human who came after him. Admiral Korvax was called to testify first, and he walked to the witness platform with careful dignity, and his jaw was bandaged, and when he spoke his words were slightly slurred, and I was conducting a disciplinary demonstration, and the Admiral said, and the human cadet became violent without provocation, and he struck me with full force, and as you can see the injuries are severe, and 3 teeth were completely destroyed, and 2 more damaged. beyond natural regeneration, and this attack was unprovoked and unjustified, and I recommend immediate expulsion and criminal prosecution. Battle Commander Krell leaned forward, and its forearms folded across its chest. And Admiral, you stated the attack was unprovoked, and is this accurate? And did you not have physical contact with the cadet before he struck you? And Korvax's eyes narrowed, and I merely grasped his uniform collar, and this is a standard disciplinary technique used across the coalition. And there was nothing threatening in the gesture. You lifted him off the ground, and Krell's voice was flat, and you suspended him in the air, and you did this in front of 300 witnesses, and do you deny this? And the Admiral's jaw worked, and I do not deny it. But this does not justify violence, and the battle commander made a note on the data pad before it, and we shall see. The prosecution presented its case, and it was straightforward and damning, and visual recordings from multiple angles showed the strike and showed the Admiral's blood and showed the broken teeth, and medical reports detailed the injuries, and character witnesses spoke about the importance of discipline and about the dangers of allowing violent species into positions of authority. And when they finished, Tai Sung knew that nothing he could say would change the facts, and he had struck a superior officer, and the penalty for that was expulsion at minimum. Then something unexpected happened. Prile came forward, and the small bird creature was shaking, but its voice was clear when amplified by the tribunal's systems. And I wished to submit evidence, and it held up a data chip, and I have been recording training sessions for personal study, and, with permission, I have documented incidents that are relevant to this case. And the magistrate gestured and proceed, and a screen appeared showing the equipment room where Taesung had been cleaning gear, and the timestamp was from 2 weeks before. The recordings played, and they showed Admiral Korvax increasing the gravity during human training sessions to levels that made the 3 humans move like they were walking through water. And they showed the Admiral assigning impossible tactical scenarios and marking the humans as failures when they could not solve problems designed to be unsolvable. And they showed Krixtel shoving Taesung in corridors while instructors looked away, and they showed the Admiral in classroom settings asking the humans questions in areas they had not been taught, and then mocking them for ignorance, and on the evidence mounted. This is systemic harassment. And Academic Chancellor Porvin's stone face showed no emotion, but its voice carried an edge. And Admiral Korvax, you have repeatedly and deliberately created hostile conditions for these cadets, and the Admiral's scales seemed to darken, and I was preparing them for the rigors of coalition service, and Deathworlders require stricter training. And Porvin made a sound like grinding rocks in stricter training or targeted abuse. And where is the line? Admiral, more witnesses came forward, and Unlar, the floating gas being submitted engineering data, showing the gravity modifications, and the readings were damning, and the levels used during human training sessions were high enough to cause permanent injury, and could potentially have been fatal. And Krixtel, the tall insectoid, came next, and the squadron leader's testimony was brief and direct, and I followed the Admiral's example in my treatment of the human cadets, and I believed I was upholding proper standards. And I now understand I was participating in harassment, and I was wrong. And I apologize. Battle Commander Krell turned to Taesung and Cadet. You have been silent during these testimonies, and do you wish to speak in your own defense? And Taesung took a breath and, yes, sir. And he stepped forward. And I struck Admiral Korvax. And this is not in question. But I need you to understand why. Tell us then. And the magistrate's energy pulsed. When the Admiral grabbed me, and Taesung chose his words carefully, and something in my brain responded before I could think. And humans evolved on a world where physical aggression meant death, and when something grabs you, it is trying to kill you or eat you, and our response is automatic. And we strike with maximum force because anything less means we die, and I am not making excuses, and I am explaining biology. So, you claim you could not control yourself, and Krell's voice was skeptical, and that your violence is involuntary. No, sir, and Taesung met the battle commander's gaze, and I could have controlled it if I had been prepared, but the Admiral spent weeks conditioning us to constant stress and elevated adrenaline and reduced sleep and inadequate nutrition. And he studied Earth biology, and he knew exactly what he was doing, and he created the conditions for my response, and then he triggered it deliberately. Admiral Korvax rose from his seat, and this is absurd. And the human is attempting to blame me for his own lack of discipline, and Grand Magistrate. Thelnora's voice cut through the room like a blade. "And Admiral, you will sit down, and you will remain silent until asked to speak." And the energy being's framework glowed brighter, and we are beginning to see a pattern here. Hyjin was called next, and she walked to the witness platform with her usual calm precision, and the tribunal asked her to explain human stress responses, and she did so in clinical detail. And our adrenal system is designed for immediate life or death situations, and prolonged stress causes a condition called adrenal fatigue, where our threat responses become hyperactive. And the Admiral deliberately induced this state through sleep deprivation and inadequate nutrition and excessive physical demands, and then he triggered a threat response by initiating physical contact in a dominant display. And Taesung's reaction was predictable and possibly inevitable. Academic Chancellor Porvin leaned back, "And so you are saying, the Admiral essentially set a trap?" "Yes, Chancellor," and Hyejin's voice was steady, "and a trap designed to prove that humans are violent and uncontrollable. And instead it proved that we are predictable when you understand our biology, and any species can be manipulated if you study them carefully enough." The tribunal went into recess, and Taesung was led to a small waiting room where Junwoo and Hyejin joined him, and they sat in silence for a long time before Junwoo spoke. "And do you think it will matter? And all the evidence and all the explanations? And do you think they will care?" And Taesung shook his head. "And I do not know, and I honestly do not know." 2 hours later they were called back, and the chamber felt colder somehow. And the 3 judges looked down at Taesung, and Grand Magistrate Thelnora spoke. "And this tribunal has reached a decision. And, Admiral Korvax, you are found guilty of systemic harassment and abuse of authority, and creating a hostile environment and violation of the Coalition Equal Treatment Mandate. And you are hereby stripped of your training command and reassigned to administrative duties pending a full review of your conduct, and furthermore, you will issue a formal apology to the human cadets you have wronged." The Admiral's face was unreadable, but his hands clenched and understood, and he said nothing more. "Cadet," Taesung and the magistrate turned its attention to him, "and you are found guilty of striking a superior officer. And this is a serious offense, regardless of circumstances, and however we acknowledge significant." The ship was called Tenacious Dawn, and it was a small rescue vessel designed for long-range operations, and Taesung stood in the docking bay looking up at its hull and thinking that everything came down to this, and one mission, and one chance, to prove that humans belonged among the stars. And beside him, Junwoo was checking equipment with methodical precision, and Hyejin was already inside running system diagnostics. Footsteps echoed in the bay, and Taesung turned to see Prill approaching, and the small bird creature was carrying a travel case, and its feathers were fluffed with nervousness. "And I am coming with you," and it said, and I volunteered, "and if you will have me." And Taesung felt surprise and warmth. "And of course, and we would be honored." And Prill's feathers smoothed slightly, "and I have never done anything brave before, but you stood up when no one else would, and I want to help." More footsteps, and Unlar floated into the bay, and its gas bubble shimmered. "And I also have volunteered, and the Coalition needs data on how different species respond to extreme conditions. And also, I am curious about humans, and you are fascinating and terrifying in equal measure." And Taesung smiled. "And welcome aboard." The last volunteer surprised everyone, and Crixtel walked into the bay, and the tall insectoid's forearms hung at its sides, and its compound eyes reflected the lights like tiny stars. And before anyone could speak, it said, "And I wish to apologize properly, and I was wrong in how I treated you, and I followed the Admiral's example without thinking and without questioning. And that was cowardice, and I want a chance to make it right." And Junwoo crossed his arms, "And you beat the hell out of Taesung in that combat." Drill and Crixtel's head lowered. "And I know, and I am sorry, and if you will let me, I will make amends." Taesung stepped forward and extended his hand in human custom for reconciliation. And he said, and Crixtel looked at the hand and then carefully wrapped one of its 4 hands around Taesung's, and they shook and welcomed the crew. And Taesung said, "And we leave in 1 hour." The journey to Deep Void Research Station Epsilon took 6 days through normal space, and the crew used that time to prepare and to learn about each other. And Prill taught them the basics of advanced navigation, and Unlar explained the theory behind the schism and how dimensions could overlap when gravity wells interacted in certain ways, and Crixtel showed them Mantari combat techniques that relied on precision rather than strength. And the humans in turn shared Earth customs and stories, and gradually something like trust began to form. Aijin spent most of her time studying the station's last transmissions, and the messages were fragmentary and corrupted, but certain phrases kept appearing and detected anomaly in subdimensional readings, and something is aware of us, and don't look directly at the void, and they came through the walls, and she compiled everything into a report and presented it to the crew on the 5th day. And I think whatever happened there is not natural, and I think they opened something they should not have opened. The schism itself was visible long before they reached it, and space became strange and stars appeared in the wrong positions and light bent around invisible masses and colors existed that had no names. And Priel's feathers were perpetually fluffed now, and its voice was tight with stress, and navigation here is more art than science, and we are essentially flying blind and trusting that the laws of physics remain consistent. And Junwoo looked out the viewport and grinned. And that is fine, and I never trusted physics anyway. Deep void, research station. Epsilon appeared suddenly, and one moment the screens were empty, and the next it was there, and a massive ring-shaped structure floating in the distorted space, and all its lights were dark except for the emergency beacons, and it rotated slowly and silently, and something about it felt wrong, and Tae-sung could not explain why, but every instinct he had was screaming danger, and beside him Krixtel's mandibles clicked nervously, and I feel it too, and the station looks hungry somehow. They docked without incident, and the airlock cycled and showed green, and the interior was pressurized and the gravity was functional, and by all measurements the station was safe. And yet when the door opened and they looked into the darkened corridor, beyond no one wanted to be the first to enter, and finally Tae-sung stepped forward and his hand was on his sidearm and let us go, and we have a job to do. The station was a maze of corridors and laboratories and living quarters, and everywhere they looked were signs of normal life interrupted, and meals half-eaten on tables and research notes scattered on desks and personal belongings arranged carefully in quarters. And but no people and 73 beings had been here, and now there were none, and not even bodies, and just empty spaces where people should be. Hyojin accessed a terminal and pulled up the station logs, and most of the data was corrupted, but fragments remained, and the research team had been studying the schism itself, and trying to harvest energy from the dimensional boundaries, and they had built equipment that could thin the walls between realities and make them permeable, and according to these readings they succeeded, and she looked up at the others, and they opened a hole and something came through. The lights flickered and everyone tensed, and Priel made a sound like a distressed whistle, and that should not happen, and the emergency power should be stable, and the lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dimmer, and shadows seemed to move independently in the corners, and Unalar's gas bubble began to shimmer in distress, and I am detecting temporal anomalies, and time is moving at different rates in different parts of the station, and that should be impossible. They moved deeper into the station and stayed close together, and the wrongness increased with every corridor, and gravity would shift suddenly and make them stumble, and sounds echoed from empty rooms and whispers in languages that predated civilization, and once Tae-sung turned and saw himself standing behind him but older and scarred, and when he blinked, the image was gone. And are you seeing things? And Junwoo asked, and yes. And Tae-sung admitted in things that should not be there. Krixtel stopped suddenly, and all 4 of its arms were shaking, and we should leave, and it said, and we should go back to the ship and seal the airlocks and leave this place, and whatever happened here, we cannot fight it. And but even as it spoke, none of them moved, and because somewhere deeper in the station was the answer, and somewhere in this haunted place was the key to understanding what happened to 73 researchers, and maybe how to stop it from happening again. Central Laboratory was at the station's core, and when they finally reached it, the doors were sealed and covered in warning signs in multiple languages, and Heejin worked on the access panel, and her hands were steady, but Tae-sung could see sweat on her forehead and got it, and she said, and the door slid open, and beyond was darkness so complete it seemed solid, and they stood at the threshold and looked into nothing. I am not going in there, and Priel said flatly, and I am sorry, but I cannot. And Unlar's shimmer had become erratic and agreed, and my species did not evolve to face such things. And we should call for reinforcements. And Krixtel said nothing, but all 4 of its hands were clenched. And Tae-sung looked at Junwoo and Hyojin, and we are the reinforcements, and he said, And if we do not do this, then no one will. They entered the darkness, and their light seemed to die inches from the sources, and behind them they heard Prill calling, "And be careful and please come." Back and then they were too far to hear anything except their own breathing, and the darkness pressed against them, like it had weight. And Tae-sung felt his heart hammering, but he kept moving forward, and one step, and then another, and then another. The laboratory appeared gradually, and equipment lined the walls, and in the center was a construct that hurt to look at. And it was geometric, but with too many angles, and it seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3 and around it. The air shimmered and rippled, and Hyjin approached a terminal and pulled up the final log entries, and her voice when she read them was hollow. And they succeeded, and they opened a permanent gateway, and they made contact with something on the other side. And then the log entries stopped. What took them? And Junwoo asked, and where did they go? And Tae-sung was staring at the construct. And I do not think they went anywhere, and I think they are still here, and just not in a way we can perceive. And as he said, he felt the truth of it. And the researchers had not been killed or kidnapped, and they had been changed and translated into something else, and something that existed partially in this reality and partially in others. The construct began to pulse, and light that was not light emanated from its center. And the 3 humans felt their minds straining and trying to comprehend what they were seeing and failing. And it was like trying to imagine a color that did not exist, and like trying to hear a sound beyond all frequencies. And Tae-sung felt his nose bleeding and tasted copper. And beside him, Hyejin gasped, and Junwoo made a sound that was not quite human. And then they understood. The entity was not hostile, and it was not even aware of them as individuals, and it was vast and ancient and incomprehensible, and it existed across dimensions and perceived reality in ways that would shatter any mind that tried to fully understand. And the researchers had opened a door, and the entity had simply noticed and reached through.